Imagine a world where the greatest limitation of human progress was never ignorance, but speed. For thousands of years, knowledge moved only as fast as a human hand could copy it. One scroll at a time, one lifetime at a time. Now imagine if that bottleneck had been shattered, not in the 15th century, but in the heart of ancient Rome. What if, at the height of Roman power, around the 1st century BCE, a simple but revolutionary idea emerged? The mass reproduction of text, not by scribes, not by slaves, but by a mechanical system capable of copying laws, philosophy, science, and military doctrine thousands of times over. The printing press, born not in Renaissance Germany, but beneath the marble columns of the Roman Forum. This single shift would not merely accelerate history, it would rewrite it entirely. In this timeline, knowledge is no longer the privilege of senators and philosophers. Soldiers read strategy manuals. Merchants study mathematics. Farmers understand engineering. Roman law spreads flawlessly across continents, unchanged, uncorrupted. Ideas no longer die with their authors. They multiply. Would there have been a dark age at all? Or would Rome, armed with mass literacy and preserved knowledge, have evolved into a proto-modern civilization? Could steam power, scientific method, or even early democracy have emerged over 1,000 years earlier? And what happens to religion when sacred texts are no longer rare, mysterious artifacts, but mass-produced objects accessible to the public? This video explores a world where information scales centuries too early, where revolutions happen before kings expect them, where empires fall not to barbarian invasions, but to ideas spreading faster than armies. Tonight, we step into a rewritten timeline, a Rome that didn't just conquer the world, but educated it. At the height of its power, Rome ruled not just through armies, but through administration. Roads, aqueducts, census systems, tax records, and legal codes formed the skeleton of the empire. Yet, despite its sophistication, Rome suffered from one fatal weakness. Information moved painfully slowly. Every law had to be copied by hand. Every philosophical work relied on scribes. Errors accumulated, meanings shifted, and entire ideas vanished when a single library burned. Knowledge was fragile, localized, and elitist. Senators guarded texts. Priests controlled doctrine. The masses consumed orders, not explanations. Literacy existed, but scale did not. This bottleneck shaped everything. Innovation stalled, not because Romans lacked intelligence, but because ideas could not replicate fast enough to survive political chaos, war, or generational change. The empire expanded faster than its knowledge systems could stabilize. Provinces received distorted versions of Roman law. Military doctrines evolved unevenly. Science remained theoretical, trapped in private circles. Rome looked eternal, yet its intellectual infrastructure was brittle. One disruption, one collapse of bureaucracy, and centuries of accumulated understanding could disappear almost overnight. This was the silent vulnerability beneath the marble and steel. A civilization advanced enough to dominate the world, yet still dependent on the human hand to preserve its own mind. The question is not why Rome eventually fell, but why it lasted as long as it did under such constraints. Now imagine a rupture in that limitation, somewhere between the late Republic and early Empire. Roman engineers, masters of mechanics and leverage, combine existing technologies in an unexpected way. Screw presses used for olives and wine, ink formulas already known, standardized alphabets, modular metal stamps. The result is not a modern printing press, but something revolutionary by ancient standards. A repeatable system capable of producing identical texts in large quantities. Suddenly, copying a law takes minutes instead of weeks. Military manuals can be distributed before campaigns. Governors receive uniform legal codes rather than corrupted summaries. Knowledge becomes consistent. That alone changes everything. Rome was obsessed with standardization. Weights, measures, roads, citizenship. A printing system fits perfectly into its imperial logic. It would not emerge as a tool of rebellion, but as a tool of control. The state would adopt it first. Senate decrees, imperial edicts, tax rules, and court procedures would flood the empire in identical form. For the first time, Rome would speak with one unbroken voice across continents. Information would no longer decay with distance. The empire would become tighter, colder, more precise. This is not enlightenment yet. This is optimization. And optimization is where Rome thrived best. The immediate consequence would be administrative dominance. Provinces like Gaul, Hispania, and Syria would no longer rely on local interpretation of Roman authority. Printed legal texts reduce corruption. Appeals become possible. Precedent stabilizes. Roman law, already one of history's most influential systems, hardens into something nearly immutable. Bureaucrats gain power. Local elites lose flexibility. The empire becomes less negotiable, more mechanical. But with this rigidity comes longevity. Rebellions face a population that understands exactly what Rome promises and demands. Ambiguity vanishes. So does plausible deniability. At the same time, literacy begins to spread, not out of idealism, but necessity. To function within the system, merchants, soldiers, and minor officials must read. The state incentivizes education. Schools multiply, not academies of philosophy, but practical institutions teaching law, arithmetic, and logistics. Rome becomes a civilization of trained operators. This does not create freedom. It creates efficiency, and efficiency compounds. A literate empire is harder to fracture. Ideas still flow from the top, but they now reach the bottom intact. The Roman machine, once held together by tradition and fear, begins to rely on documentation and process. That shift alone delays collapse by generations. Yet the printing press cannot remain purely bureaucratic for long. Once the infrastructure exists, content diversifies. Philosophical schools seize the opportunity. Stoic texts circulate beyond elite circles. Epicurean ideas spread quietly among merchants and veterans. Medical manuals travel intact from Greece to Britain. Engineering diagrams survive replication. For the first time, Roman science gains memory. Discoveries no longer reset each generation. Errors can be corrected, not forgotten. This is where history bends sharply. A civilization with preserved technical knowledge does not regress easily. Even during crises, books endure. Libraries become strategic assets. Burning them becomes an act of war. Knowledge itself turns political. Competing ideologies accelerate. Orthodoxy struggles to keep pace with replication. Rome, built on control, now faces a paradox. The very tool that strengthens administration also amplifies dissent. Ideas can outrun censorship. Once texts exist in thousands of copies, suppression becomes expensive and imperfect. The empire has created a force it cannot fully govern. The press does not topple Rome overnight, but it introduces instability of a new kind: intellectual momentum. By the end of this first century of mass text, Rome is no longer just an empire of territory. It is an empire of information. Its citizens think in written systems. Its institutions depend on documentation. Its future hinges not on generals alone, but on authors, editors, and distributors. This Rome does not slide easily into a dark age. Collapse, if it comes, looks different. Fragmentation rather than amnesia. Successor states inherit libraries, not ruins. Technology plateaus higher. Progress pauses, but does not reset. The medieval world as we know it never fully materializes. Europe grows from a preserved Roman blueprint, instead of rediscovering it centuries later. All of this begins not with steam engines or electricity, but with ink, pressed onto parchment at scale. A simple mechanical shift that transforms civilization's relationship with memory. Rome always sought eternity through monuments. In this timeline, it achieves something far closer: continuity. And continuity is the foundation of everything that follows. Once mass printing exists, literacy stops being a cultural trait and becomes a strategic necessity. Rome does not promote reading out of compassion or enlightenment, but out of survival. An empire that runs on documents requires operators who can decode them. Orders, contracts, supply manifests, legal appeals. Everything becomes text-bound. The Roman state begins to formalize education, not as philosophy, but as infrastructure. Local schools appear near military camps, trade hubs, and administrative centers. Their curriculum is brutally practical: reading, writing, arithmetic, law. No rhetoric, no art, no poetry, unless it serves function. Literacy spreads downward through the social hierarchy faster than at any other point in ancient history. Soldiers learn to read manuals. Merchants study tariffs and weights. Tax collectors rely on written precedent rather than memory or coercion. This fundamentally changes power dynamics. Authority no longer rests solely in spoken commands or personal reputation, but in documented legitimacy. A literate population is easier to regulate, but also harder to deceive. Rome gains compliance, but loses mystique. The empire begins to resemble a system rather than a myth. And systems, once built, tend to outlast individuals. The army transforms first. Roman legions were already disciplined, but now they become standardized at an unprecedented level. Training manuals are identical across provinces. Tactical doctrines are fixed, replicated, and refined rather than reinvented by each general. After-action reports circulate empire-wide. Successful strategies spread rapidly. Failed ones are archived and avoided. This accelerates military evolution by centuries. Rome's enemies face not just experience, but accumulated institutional memory. War becomes less dependent on charismatic commanders and more on procedural superiority. Logistics improve dramatically. Supply chains are documented, predictable, optimized. Desertion drops as contracts become explicit. Veterans understand their entitlements. The Legion becomes less a brotherhood and more a machine. This does not weaken it. It makes it relentless. Rebellions become harder because Rome learns faster than its opponents. Every uprising generates documentation. Every suppression feeds doctrine. Violence becomes bureaucratic, efficient, scalable. In this timeline, Rome's military dominance is not just physical, it is informational. Commerce follows. Printed contracts replace oral agreements. Prices stabilize as market information spreads. Merchants no longer rely solely on local knowledge. Trade manuals circulate with routes, risks, and profit margins. Insurance-like arrangements emerge. Credit systems become more sophisticated. Literacy turns trade into an abstract system rather than a personal network. This favors large-scale operations over small actors. Wealth concentrates faster, but also moves faster. Economic integration deepens between provinces. A merchant in Alexandria understands markets in Gaul. Rome inches toward a proto-capitalist structure, centuries ahead of schedule. With this comes tension. Traditional elites, landowners, patricians, priesthoods lose monopoly over knowledge. New power centers emerge: administrators, financiers, logisticians. Status shifts from lineage to competence. Rome does not become egalitarian, but it becomes merit-sensitive. And merit, once measurable, disrupts rigid hierarchies. Social mobility increases slightly, but enough to destabilize old norms. Religion cannot remain untouched. Once texts are mass-produced, doctrine loses flexibility. Priests can no longer quietly reinterpret tradition without detection. Competing religious ideas spread faster and farther. Mystery cults, Eastern philosophies, and early monotheistic concepts circulate in written form. Belief becomes comparative. People read multiple explanations of existence. Faith turns ideological. This forces religious institutions to formalize theology earlier than in our timeline. Orthodoxy hardens. Heresy multiplies. The state watches carefully. Rome tolerated religion as long as it remained localized and loyal. Mass text breaks localization. A belief system can now leap provinces without armies. This alarms authorities. Censorship emerges not as moral policing, but as state security. Controlling texts becomes as important as controlling borders. For the first time, Rome confronts an enemy it cannot execute easily: ideas that replicate silently. By the 2nd century of printing, Rome is no longer just ruling bodies, it is shaping minds. Education Military doctrine, commerce, and belief systems all flow through written channels the state partially controls, but never fully owns. This creates a fragile equilibrium. The empire grows stronger structurally, yet more volatile ideologically. Stability increases in the short term. Long-term unpredictability rises. Rome has built an engine that amplifies everything. Order and dissent alike. History accelerates. Change compresses. The future approaches faster than Rome's political instincts can adapt. The empire has weaponized literacy. And every weapon, once deployed, reshapes the battlefield in ways its creators never fully anticipate. The moment information scales beyond elite control, power begins to drift. Rome was built on hierarchy, tradition, and controlled access. Controlled access to land, citizenship, law, and above all, knowledge. The printing press quietly dissolves this architecture. At first, texts serve the state. Then, they serve institutions. Eventually, they serve individuals. Philosophers no longer depend on patronage to survive. Their ideas persist independently of their lives. A Stoic argument printed in Hispania can influence a soldier in Judea decades later. A legal critique written in Alexandria can resurface in Gaul long after its author is dead. For the first time, Rome faces temporal resistance, opposition that does not require organization, leadership, or immediacy. Ideas wait. They persist. They accumulate readers across generations. This fundamentally alters how dissent works. Rebellion no longer needs swords. It needs coherence. Written critique transforms dissatisfaction into ideology. Rome can crush uprisings. It cannot easily erase concepts once they are copied thousands of times. The empire's traditional response, force, becomes inefficient. Killing a man does not kill his argument. Burning one library does not destroy a distributed archive. The printing press introduces something Rome has never faced before: irreversible intellectual diffusion. From this point onward, the empire is no longer fighting enemies. It is competing with narratives. This shift forces the Roman state into ideological self-defense. Censorship evolves rapidly. Not crude suppression, but selective amplification. Approved texts are subsidized, replicated, and distributed. Unapproved ones are taxed, restricted, or quietly criminalized. The state does not attempt total control. That would be impossible. But statistical dominance. Flood the empire with loyal narratives and drown out dissent. This strategy works temporarily, but it creates a new profession: editors, compilers, interpreters. Power migrates again, this time into the hands of those who decide which texts deserve reproduction. Political authority begins to fracture internally. Senators argue not just over territory, but over interpretation. Law itself becomes contested terrain. Precedent can be cited against power now, not just enforced by it. Courts transform. Appeals multiply. Legal philosophy emerges earlier than in our timeline. Justice becomes something that can be debated in writing, compared across cases, and challenged intellectually. This is progress, but progress is destabilizing. Once law becomes an argument rather than a decree, Legitimacy must be continuously justified. Rome's authority shifts from divine inevitability to documented rationale. That transition is fragile. Empires thrive on inevitability. When citizens begin to believe that governance is negotiable, the psychological foundation of imperial rule erodes. Religion becomes the most volatile arena of all. In a preprint world, belief systems survive through ritual, locality, and oral reinforcement. Printing destroys locality. Doctrines spread intact across geography. Contradictions become visible. Syncretism accelerates. People compare gods, ethics, and cosmologies side by side. Faith becomes analytical. This terrifies priesthoods. To survive, religions must formalize faster, defining canon, orthodoxy, and exclusion. Heresy ceases to be deviation and becomes competition. Written belief systems begin to behave like ideologies, self-replicating, adaptive, resistant to suppression. Rome, which historically tolerated religion as long as it reinforced civic loyalty, now faces belief structures that demand moral allegiance above state authority. This conflict emerges centuries earlier than in our timeline. Monotheistic frameworks gain traction faster because printed texts preserve consistency. Converts no longer rely on memory. They rely on identical doctrine. Communities form across provinces without physical proximity. The empire reacts defensively. Loyalty tests appear. Oaths are formalized. Belief becomes political. The state is no longer arbitrating land disputes. It is arbitrating meaning, and meaning is far harder to govern. Technological consequences follow ideology. Once technical manuals can be preserved and iterated upon, innovation compounds. Roman engineering stops being static. Designs are refined rather than rediscovered. Failures are documented. Improvements spread. Water systems improve. Mining becomes more efficient. Early mechanical experimentation emerges, not because Rome suddenly becomes scientific, but because it finally develops institutional memory. Trial and error no longer resets with each generation. This does not immediately lead to industrialization, but it creates something just as important: continuity of experimentation. Curiosity becomes productive. Crafts evolve into applied sciences. This shifts class power again. Skilled technicians gain leverage. Knowledge-based labor increases in value. Rome slowly transitions from conquest-based expansion to optimization-based dominance. Growth turns inward. Efficiency replaces aggression. The empire stabilizes materially, but its social structure strains under the pressure of change. Traditional aristocracy loses relevance. Bureaucratic technocrats rise. Cultural tension sharpens between old identity and new functionality. By this stage, Rome is no longer merely managing an empire. It is managing acceleration. History itself moves faster. Feedback loops tighten. Mistakes propagate quickly. Reforms ripple across provinces in years, not centuries. This creates a paradox. Rome becomes more resilient to collapse through preservation of knowledge, yet more vulnerable to rapid transformation. Change no longer waits for invasions or plagues. It emerges internally, The empire's greatest threat is no longer external pressure, but internal evolution it cannot fully control. Printing has turned Rome into a living system, adaptive, intelligent, unstable. From here, the future forks violently. Either Rome learns to govern ideas without suffocating them, or it fractures under the weight of its own intellectual momentum. The age of static empires is over. The age of contested meaning has begun. By the time Rome realizes what it has unleashed, reversal is no longer possible. The printing infrastructure is too widespread, literacy too embedded, and institutional dependence on written systems too deep. Administration, law, commerce, and religion now require constant documentation to function at all. To remove printing would mean paralyzing the empire itself. Rome is trapped by its own success. What once strengthened control now demands adaptation at a pace Rome's political culture was never designed for. Senators were trained in tradition, not transformation. Emperors ruled through precedent, symbolism, and personal authority, not policy iteration. But this Rome requires something new. Governance that can evolve as fast as the population thinks. Pressure builds everywhere. Provincial governors begin issuing localized interpretations of imperial texts to maintain order. Legal unity starts to fracture not through rebellion, but through divergence. Different regions emphasize different clauses, precedents, and interpretations, all technically legitimate. Rome remains one empire on paper, but many empires in practice. This is not decay. It is complexity exceeding managerial capacity. The system has grown smarter than its overseers. When authority depends on explanation rather than fear, every decision invites scrutiny. Every decree must justify itself against existing texts. Power slows down while society accelerates. That asymmetry is lethal for centralized rule. Economic transformation intensifies the strain. With preserved knowledge and standardized documentation, productivity rises steadily. Infrastructure becomes cheaper to maintain. Trade expands. Wealth increases, but unevenly. Regions closest to information hubs surge ahead. Others lag. Economic inequality becomes visible, measurable, and documented. For the first time, populations can prove exploitation statistically. This fuels resentment, not rooted in hunger, but in comparison. A dangerous shift. Hungry populations revolt sporadically. Informed populations organize persistently. Rome faces coordinated economic dissent, decades, even centuries, before anything resembling modern class consciousness should exist. Guilds formalize. Merchant coalitions negotiate collectively. Labor agreements appear in written form. The economy begins to behave like a system rather than a tradition. The state attempts regulation, but regulation itself becomes a written battlefield. Every policy spawns counterarguments. Every reform creates unintended feedback loops. Rome's economy is no longer governed by land and tribute alone, but by information flow. Whoever controls contracts, records, and accounting controls reality. This redistributes power away from aristocratic landholders toward administrators and financiers. The social hierarchy stretches, not vertically, but diagonally. Old elites still possess status, but no longer command outcomes. Politically, this Rome hovers on the brink of something unprecedented. Early institutional reform. Faced with complexity, it cannot brute force. The state experiments. Advisory councils expand. Legal codification becomes systematic rather than reactive. Some emperors attempt limited representation, not democratic in spirit, but pragmatic. Feedback mechanisms appear. Petitions scale. Public commentary emerges in controlled formats. Rome inches toward proto-constitutionalism without fully understanding what it is building. Every reform stabilizes one pressure point while opening 3 new ones. Citizens begin to expect responsiveness. Expectations rise faster than capacity. Legitimacy becomes conditional. This is revolutionary. Empires survive on permanence, not performance. Once performance becomes the metric, failure becomes inevitable. Rome oscillates between reformist emperors and reactionary ones. Each swing destabilizes continuity. Progress is no longer linear, it lurches. Meanwhile, intellectuals debate governance itself. Political theory accelerates centuries early. Texts compare systems, analyze power, and propose alternatives. Some ideas are absorbed. Others circulate quietly, waiting. The concept of change as normal enters civilization's bloodstream. At that moment, stagnation becomes impossible. Externally, Rome's advantage becomes paradoxical. Militarily and technologically, it is unmatched. No neighboring power can compete with its institutional memory, logistics, or engineering continuity. Conquest becomes trivial, but pointless. Absorbing new territories only increases administrative strain. Expansion no longer solves internal tension. It amplifies it. Rome shifts from conquest to containment. Borders stabilize. The empire turns inward. This is unprecedented. A dominant power choosing restraint, not from morality, but from system overload. Yet, restraint creates vulnerability of a new kind. Rivals study Rome's texts. Knowledge leaks. What Rome prints today, its enemies may replicate tomorrow. Technological monopolies evaporate faster. The world equalizes intellectually, even if it remains unequal materially. Rome's lead shrinks, not because it weakens, but because everyone else accelerates. Global history speeds up. The empire is no longer the singular engine of progress. It is one node in a growing network of literate civilizations. By the end of this era, Rome stands at a threshold no ancient civilization ever reached. It can no longer return to myth-based authority, but it has not yet mastered adaptive governance. It possesses continuity of knowledge without continuity of ideology, stability without stagnation, chaos without collapse. This is the edge of modernity. From here, 2 futures diverge sharply. One path leads to early systemic reform, fragmentation into federated states, bound by shared legal and informational foundations. The other leads to ideological fracture, competing narratives tearing the empire apart faster than armies ever could. Either way, the classical world ends here. Not in fire, not in darkness, but in transformation. Rome does not fall. It evolves beyond itself, and evolution is far more disruptive than collapse. By the time the Roman world fully adapts to permanent information flow, history as we know it permanently diverges. The classical cycle of rise, collapse, and rediscovery simply never completes. When political unity fractures, intellectual unity does not. Libraries persist. Legal systems fragment, but remain interoperable. Successor states inherit not ruins, but documentation. Roads still decay, armies still dissolve, emperors still fall, but knowledge does not reset. Europe never enters a true dark age, because forgetting becomes structurally impossible. Even regression happens with awareness. Engineering manuals remain readable. Medical texts remain comparable. Philosophy remains cumulative rather than cyclical. This creates a continent that advances unevenly but continuously. No generation ever starts from zero. Power struggles still occur, but they are constrained by precedent and memory. The myth of divine rulers erodes earlier. Authority increasingly requires explanation. Kings rule, but lawyers define limits. Wars still happen, but their causes are recorded, analyzed, and debated in real time. History becomes self-aware, centuries ahead of schedule. Civilization does not become peaceful, but it becomes conscious of itself. And that consciousness permanently alters how societies justify violence, hierarchy, and rule. Technological development follows a different curve. Without mass amnesia, innovation compounds slowly but relentlessly. No industrial revolution explodes suddenly, because there is no long stagnation to break. Instead, mechanical refinement stretches across centuries. Water power is optimized earlier. Wind systems spread systematically. Metallurgy advances incrementally but consistently. Energy efficiency becomes a recorded discipline. Experimentation becomes institutional. Failure is archived, not lost. By the time gunpowder emerges, it is contextualized immediately within engineering theory rather than mystical novelty. Weaponization is faster, but so is countermeasure development. Balance stabilizes quicker. Technology becomes less disruptive and more integrative. This delays some breakthroughs while accelerating others. Electricity does not appear centuries early, but scientific method does. Measurement standardization spreads across regions. Mathematics becomes practical rather than abstract. By the early medieval equivalent period, this world already resembles an early modern society in mindset, if not machinery. Progress becomes predictable, and predictable progress reshapes expectations of the future itself. Religion in this world evolves under constant textual pressure. Sacred authority competes openly with philosophical critique. Doctrines must justify themselves continuously. Canon formation occurs earlier and more rigidly, but pluralism also expands faster. No single belief system dominates uncontested. Faith becomes identity, not inevitability. Religious conflict still exists, but it is framed intellectually rather than purely violently. Councils debate publicly. Schisms are documented and compared. Moral philosophy separates gradually from divine command. Ethics becomes a written discipline, accessible beyond clergy. This does not secularize society completely, but it diversifies legitimacy. Political authority can no longer rely solely on divine endorsement. It must appeal to law, utility, and stability. This reshapes governance permanently. The idea that power exists to manage systems, rather than embody destiny, becomes normal. By the time something resembling democracy emerges, it feels evolutionary rather than revolutionary. Governance is expected to adapt. That expectation is the true revolution. Globally, this Rome-centered acceleration alters every civilization it touches. Literacy spreads through trade, not conquest. Knowledge leaks faster than armies move. Asia, Africa, and Europe synchronize intellectually far earlier. Cultural isolation collapses. Civilizations rise together rather than sequentially. No single region monopolizes modernity. Colonialism as we know it never fully forms, because informational asymmetry never grows large enough. Exploitation still exists, but it faces resistance equipped with documentation, coordination, and comparative analysis. Empires become federations or dissolve into networks. Borders soften. Influence replaces domination. History becomes multipolar centuries early. Conflict remains, but total civilizational collapse becomes rare. Humanity advances chaotically, but collectively. The planet does not become unified. It becomes entangled, and entanglement makes total regression almost impossible. This is the ultimate consequence of a Roman printing press. Not utopia, not tyranny, but continuity. A world where humanity never forgets what it learns. Where progress is slow, contested, uneven, but permanent. Our modern world, in comparison, is a product of recovery. This world would be a product of accumulation. Fewer dramatic leaps, fewer catastrophic losses, more accountability, more foresight. History would feel less like a series of collapses and more like a long argument carried across generations. Rome would not be remembered as an empire that fell, but as the civilization that taught humanity how to remember itself. And in doing so, it would quietly change the most important force in history. Not power, not technology, not religion, but time itself.